Hi everybody, and welcome to SawdustU and our next video in our series on how to upgrade your table saw. These series of videos of course deal with building your precision fence. Now in the previous video we dealt with creating the base for your glide blocks, cutting the channels with your dado blade, and screwing the guide blocks using that method of pressing down and transferring the mark from the 4 holes on the back of the guide blocks to your base. We also talked about the holes in the side of the guide blocks and on the bottom so you can control the tension on the rails. You can see these are just smoothly moving. There's no resistance, but moves beautifully. So that's good to go. You'll notice here I do not have my bolts installed. Now you will not at this point have drilled your holes anyway. But for the sake of this installation, the next step, you just want to clamp your base to your side table, clamp it down good so it's rigid, but you want the capability of moving that around before you do your final setup. So that's where we're going to take it. Now, and once again, I will refer you to our website where we have schematics and drawings on all this. And if you use both the website at SawdustU.com and these videos together, depending on your level of expertise on these kinds of stuff, you will find, I think you'll get all your questions answered. Now the next thing we're going to do is these rail end supports that I have, and they've been used throughout the system. We used them on the sliding table if you watched those videos. And they're very nice aluminum. They're precision designed to go over these 20mm rails that we use. And we use that as a way to intersect to the fence body itself. So the first thing you want to do is you can see I have masking tape on my side table and I put a pencil mark on the center. This is a 27-inch table saw, so it's 13.5 inches in. And then I've marked also the center of my 36-inch long tube, obviously 18 inches. So I'm going to lock that in place. Now you won't have the clamping mechanism on yours at this point. So you'll have to get the center mark lined up and then use a clamp front and rear to hold it in place while you manipulate the assembly here. So now the first thing I'm going to do is take my fence. I want to measure to the center, 18 inches in this case, but I need to know where my end rail supports are going to go. So I need to know what the center to center distance is on my rails. The way I do that is very simple. In fact, I'll use this. You take your square, you put it on the inside face closest to me here, and take your steel rail and measure over to the same analogous face, in other words the inside face closest to me on the far rail. So I do that and press up against that and I read it back, and I've got 25 centimeters, 250 millimeters. That's what I set it up for, so that's great. So I know my distance center to center for my rails, in my case, is 25 centimeters. Yours you might do it in inches, whatever it is, you want to be able to transfer that mark to your fence. So I've got my center point, I go 125 millimeters this way and 125 millimeters towards me. That gives me the center to center distance for the location of my end rail supports. Next thing I need to do is get the horizontal component of the line for the center of these screws that hold them in place. That's easy to do. Take my calipers, set them on depth, go down here to the top of the rail, and I've got 50.0. Do the same thing over here. 50.0, that's perfect. So I know to the top of the rail is 50 millimeters, but they're 20 millimeter thick rails, so if I come down half of that to get into the center, I want to go 40 millimeters off of the work surface here to the center of this rail. So that's what I want to do. Leave my fence in position here, because you notice the little felt tabs here? I don't know if we discussed those yet or not. Those help reduce the surface friction between the fence and your work table and just make it glide easier. So it's going to raise the fence up just a little bit. So you want to leave your fence in position and then measure up 40 millimeters at this end. Scribe your mark, come over 40 millimeters here, scribe your mark, lay it flat. Now of course your end rail supports would not be on your tube at this point. Take your steel rule and mark your horizontal component. Now you've got the center of your end rail supports marked, and you've got the horizontal line for your bolt holes. Now the next thing you need to do is take your calipers again, because I could give you the number on my end rail supports, but yours might be different. I don't know if you're going to use my suppliers or you have your own. But even if you were using my suppliers, there's no guarantee that the version you get is going to be within a millimeter of the ones I have. So take your calipers, same thing, measure center to center on these. In other words, pick the outside edge of one hole to the analogous edge on the other hole and measure it with your calipers. If I do it with these, and I've got 48.0 millimeters. So I know from my center line that I've put on my fence face, I want to go 24 millimeters on either side of that line, and that will be the center of this hole. So I take my rule, or can use calipers, whatever I want. I can center it on my mark and go 24 millimeters that way, 24 millimeters this way, same thing here. Now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 crosses, if you will, on the face of my fence that mark the center location for my holes for my end rail support. I can take those over to the drill press and drill them out, and as I think I go into later in this same video, I'll talk about how we have 5/16 inch holes for these 4 holes to give ourselves a little bit of play for adjustment. I'll go into that later on in the same video. So I'll take a break here. We'll have a little segue blackout in the video, but stay here because it's going to pick right up again when turning the page, and we'll finish this video on this phase of it, and then the other videos follow accordingly. These end support blocks in. Now the trick is, when you've got those holes, is how do you get your grade 8 1/4" bolts inside the end of a tube and in the right position. It's very simple to do. Use something about the size of a yardstick, cut a little notch at the end, just enough to hold the hex head of the bolt, put a lock washer on the bolt, slide it down your tube into the inside, just side over it like this, lift it up, put a nut on it to hold it in place on both of them, do front and rear, and now you've got the bolts through the system, through the thickness of the fence head itself. Then you can lift them up, hold them in place with a razor knife, a hacksaw blade, something like that. Set your guide end rail support on top of them, and then put your nuts on top of that to hold them in place. Then what I do is I put it back in the position, slide the rails back, make sure they're aligned, everything looks good, this stays square, I'm happy with everything. I've got these coplanar, everything's good there. Now I back off the nuts one at a time, put a drop of permanent thread lock or thread sealant on it, tighten it down almost dead tight, do all 4, check it again, then I go back and ratchet them down all the way. Those are now on permanently, so I know they're good there. So now I've got my rails, I've got my base, and I've got my fence attached to the rails. So I'm good for that point. Now I can loosen these hex nuts, and I know whenever I put it back, that'll be in perfect alignment. You saw how beautifully it slides back and forth. It's a very, very slick system. So now the tricky part, and that's getting this front and rear mechanism to grab the fence front and rear, and to do it evenly and with even pressure and at the same time. And what I'm going to do there is I'll go over here in a minute. I've got a little wooden mock-up set. I'll show you basically what the concept is, and then I'll take you over to my little wooden mock-up, and we'll run through the cabling system. I'm going to try to do a little schematic on the website, SawdustU.com, because it's a little tricky to explain, but it's really very simple and straightforward. And once you see it with different colored inks, and I've got different colored cables over there, I think you'll be able to follow it easily enough. One other mention here is I wanted to be able to have something that would grab the ends of the saw and the front, but also would be replaceable. So what I did is on the stainless steel posts, I put a piece of industrial grade 3M Velcro, the hook part of it, and then I cut some little squares of hook and loop plywood. So what it enables me to do is, if I get glue, you can see the sawdust that's built up on the end there, is I can just cut a little square about 1 inch by 1.5 inches, stick it on with the Velcro, and I'm good to go for another month or two or whatever it might be. So it made a nice system to keep it nice and tight and really grips beautifully. So how it works, you basically start, you see I've got a notch here in the end, I've got a hole in the center, and I've got another notch here at the end. Now, I actually changed handles. In fact, if you can see it, this handle sticks about 1/2 inch proud of the fence. If I were to do this all over again, I could move the whole system inward a little bit so it wouldn't stick out like that. But it aligned so beautifully when I got it all set up, I didn't want to mess with it. It really works beautifully, and I love the way it just locks in place. I've got a source for this handle too on under the list of materials, so you can duplicate that. Now, basically what we're doing here is I took the little pad that used to be, this was a hold down clamp, and I took the pad off of the end and I put on a piece of 1/4 inch aluminum plate. In that plate I drilled 3 holes, one in the center which allowed me to attach it to the piston on the handle, and 2 which would hold my cables. Each hand of the rein, once again going back to the horse analogy. You've got one pulling on this from here, and one goes around the center post and comes back and pulls on that. So it's got a total retraction, I'm going to say, of 1 inch, and in that inch it pulls that aircraft quality stainless steel cable just tight as a bowstring and locks these in place beautifully. It's a very simple, easy system. So here we go. You'll notice, I'm going to turn this like this so I'm parallel to the camera so you can hopefully see that. The one closest to me, the post here, do you notice it's almost to the edge here? These walls are 1/4 inch thick, so it's pushed over that way. This one is going a little bit the other way. All that does is enable the cables to pass each other inside the cavity here without binding each other. That's accomplished very easily. This is a 1 inch stainless steel post, same thing back there. I've got a total of 1.5 inches on the inside. I can make up that space with combination of steel and nylon washers, so I can control their positioning. Works like a charm. So basically, on this end, I take a threaded steel rod, I drill a hole through one end, I turn it, you might be able to see that. Can you see that right in there? It's a simple thing. It's a 1/4, or maybe it's a 5/16 threaded rod. I put a little punch on it and I drilled a hole through it. I ran my cable through it and looped it and crimped it on. And then I fed the rod. See how that's loose now because the handle isn't down? And I've got a nylon lock nut right there. So what that enables me to do is when I set it, if they're not pulling at the same time, when you crank the handle down, it'll tend to pull it off center. I'm exaggerating it, but it'll do this. In other words, if one of the rear grabs first, it'll tend to pull it that way and vice versa. So what this does, it enables me to adjust the tension on that cable. I just put a pair of needle nose pliers on the end and I can turn that lock nut back and forth, and we're talking a couple of turns to get them pressing with the same amount, or pulling with the same amount of force. So it's a very slight adjustment and it works perfectly. I also have a little spring in there that keeps that back, just so when I'm moving it back and forth across the table, it's not rubbing on the sandpaper, and it gives a nice smooth glide. You saw how beautifully it moves. So I take that cable that came off of my threaded rod, run it down the thing here, all the way to my aluminum plate on my handle. That's one. That's fairly straightforward. I'm pulling directly on the end cable, just as easy as pie. The next one, I drill a hole through my post, crimp an end cap on it, pull it here. Through this hole, I've got a grade 8 bolt that goes through there. The cable wraps around that, comes back here, and attaches to the other hole on that aluminum plate. So that when I pull this, I'm pulling on both cables at the same time, and with this adjustment mechanism here, I can make sure they're both pulling with the same amount of pressure. So it's a nice system. One quick comment. This point here, I've got all the bolts that I've used in this assemblage are grade 8. You could use grade 5 too. And threaded into the aluminum. This is tempered aluminum, so it's very strong, doesn't have any problem holding a thread. A tap, I'm sorry. And But what I did here at this point, it was more of a precaution than anything else, because if you just put a bolt, you've got the threads there, and I didn't want the cables rubbing on the threads because it might cause them to break. So what I did was found a little piece of, actually it was a stainless steel tube off of some gizmo I'd had. I cut it to length, and I put a washer at each end. So let me show, and I'll show you on the mock-up here in a second. I've got the bolt, and I've got a sleeve over that bolt that's fairly snug up against the walls of the inside of my fence. But in addition to that, I have a washer that prevents the cables from sliding down and pinching between the wall and my sleeve. Because you don't want to have it you want to be able to go back and forth a million times without having that cable pull down there. If it were to bind there, it would just make it for a Mickey Mouse setup. So that's fairly straightforward. This is pretty good. So I'm going to end this now. Maybe I'll bring it over here. I'll bring the wooden mock-up over here, and I'll wire it up for you guys, and I think it'll make sense, hopefully. And if it doesn't, I'll try to do a schematic on the website. You can check that out, and I'll also have some close-ups of this, and hopefully it'll make sense to you. So thanks for watching, and next video is coming up in a little bit.